behind the scenes and come into his own, especially in the wild final week in California.
Tuesday night was a particularly joyous night. Robert Francis Kennedy was 42 years old and had just won the victory of his political life in the California presidential primary. He spoke to his supporters, heard their cheers, and invited them to Chicago. Senator Kennedy was a very happy man as he made his way out of the crowd into the hotel kitchen, into the range of a young, swarthy assailant. The senator was hit by 2 bullets. 5 other persons were also wounded as bullets sprayed the kitchen. Only the senator was critically hurt. Police later identified the alleged assailant as 24-year-old Siran Siran, a native Jordanian who came to this country 11 years ago. Siran's brother Adel is said to have given the name to police. Fingerprints later confirmed that identification. Among the things discovered in a search of Siran's personal effects was a newspaper clipping criticizing Senator Kennedy's support of United States aid to Israel, and a notebook with scribbled lines saying Kennedy must be killed before June 5th. The suspect himself reportedly has refused to talk with police. He would not even tell them his name. Robert Kennedy was shot at 12:15 a.m. Pacific Coast Time. The end of a brilliant political and public career. At the age of 42, Robert Francis Kennedy was dead.
Robert Francis Kennedy, born November 20th, 1925, stands behind his father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, in this 1934 family portrait. He was 8 years old, the third of 4 sons in a family of 9 children. The eldest son, Joseph Jr., was killed in World War II. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, assassinated in 1963, 3 years after becoming President of the United States, sits behind his mother, the former Rose Fitzgerald. Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy hold the 4th son, Edward, now Senator from Massachusetts. Joseph P. Kennedy went to London in 1937 as U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain. Robert, then 11, is on the far right. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought most of the ambassador's family back home. Robert poses aboard the SS Washington in New York Harbor with his mother and 2 of his sisters, Eunice, far left, and Kathleen. Kathleen was killed in an air crash in 1948. During vacations from Massachusetts Milton Academy in the early 1940s, Robert relaxed with the family at their winter home in Palm Beach, Florida. He strolls here with sisters Eunice at left and Jean. He entered Harvard in 1943, but left shortly after to join the Navy, where on his request he served aboard the newly commissioned destroyer, named for his brother Joe, killed in action the year before. Back at Harvard in 1946, Robert posed on the steps of the varsity club with 3 fellow members of the football team. He played end that year, and after graduating in 1948, he entered law school at the University of Virginia. His marriage came in 1950. In a ceremony at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut, Ethel Skakel, shown here at left, became Mrs. Robert F. Kennedy. Eunice Kennedy, who was to marry Sergeant Shriver, is at right. Robert received his law degree in 1951 and became widely known in the years immediately following. First as a counsel for Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigating subcommittee in the Senate. Later, under Senator McClellan, as chief counsel for the subcommittee. He and Ethel began raising a family during those years. One of the most controversial episodes in Kennedy's career, a subject often brought up by political opponents over the years, was his service as assistant counsel to the McCarthy Committee. This was 1953, when McCarthy, after rocking the nation with charges of communism in high places, became embroiled in a battle with Army officials represented by Attorney Joseph Welch. The stormy hearings, which arose from McCarthy's claims of subversion at an Army camp, led to the eclipse of Senator McCarthy's career, and to the resignation of Robert Kennedy from the committee after 6 months' service. Kennedy had been feuding with McCarthy's chief counsel, Roy Cohn. But Kennedy was to return to the committee as counsel for the Democrats, and ultimately he succeeded Cohn as chief counsel and staff director. In 1957, Kennedy stepped into a role that was to heighten his reputation as a tough investigator, chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee. He began an investigation into the Teamsters Union and found a major adversary, Teamsters President James Hoffa. Their exchanges were abrasive.
What action did you take to find out whether these locals had members, whether these locals were gangster-run, whether there were racketeers in charge of them? What did you do then, Mr. Hoffa?
Mr. Kennedy, it was not my responsibility in the New York area to do anything, and the General President was enjoined by Martin Lacey.
Hoffa charged that Kennedy was conducting a vendetta against him and used the word ruthless to describe him, a word that many other critics later used, that Kennedy himself came to joke about. Kennedy was often described as a kind of lightning rod during the successful 1960 presidential campaign of his brother, John F. Kennedy. It was Robert, their associate said, who handled the tough jobs and took the criticism, leaving his brother free to accept the adulation of the crowds. By all accounts, Robert Kennedy ran a brilliant and tireless campaign that year, working behind the scenes to persuade the politicians to support his brother, while John Kennedy went to the people. One political associate said recently that the one major drawback in Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign was that he did not have anyone to do the kind of job he used to do for his brother. Over Robert Kennedy's objections, but at the insistence of both his brother, the president, and his father, Robert Kennedy was named Attorney General in his brother's cabinet. Joe Kennedy commented, "Nepotism my foot. Why would anyone think that Bobby needs a job?" President Kennedy said with humor, "I can't see that it's wrong to give him a little legal experience before he goes out to practice law." Attorney General Kennedy was a member of the National Security Council and a trusted advisor to his brother. Some say it was he who came up with the diplomatic ploy that solved the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two brothers stood together during the dark days of integration battles at the universities of Mississippi and Alabama. President Kennedy confided in his younger brother. Others admired him, but he made enemies during those days. In the South, in the unions, and in big business during the 1962 steel price dispute. Robert Kennedy toured the world in February 1962 as the second most important man in the American government. He met an independent President Sukarno, who wanted to take New Guinea from the Dutch by force. Kennedy's message, the issue must be settled not by force, but by negotiation. Ethel Kennedy's appearance, a strategic one, came later. The Kennedys visited the ancient, normally quiet shrine of Nara in Japan, but quiet gave way to the aura of American and Kennedy fame. The Kennedy guides, then Ambassador and Mrs. Edwin Reischauer. Mrs. Reischauer is Japanese. At Japanese schools and factories, Kennedy was mobbed like a teenager's idol. He told his hosts he wanted a minimum of ceremony, a lot of face-to-face meetings with the people. The result was reminiscent of his brother's 1960 campaign. The Kennedy visit to Waseda University brought him together with a vast mob of students, many of them hostile leftists. But in a give-and-take session in the auditorium, he would acquit himself well. There were some bruising encounters with Japanese businessmen after a breakfast of clam soup, dried seaweed, crab meat, and chicken with bamboo shoots. The Japanese protested our high tariffs. Kennedy talked about American worries over competition from cheap foreign labor and our own unemployment problems. From Tokyo, the Kennedys went on to Hong Kong, where he saw the thousands of refugees, primarily from Red China, in the city's many congested apartment buildings. Kennedy also took to the streets and was mobbed by hundreds of young Chinese. The Kennedy visit to Vietnam was a visit to Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Airport. They left the plane briefly during an hour-and-a-half stopover. At the time, of course, in 1962, there were far fewer Americans there than there are now. It was a matter of seeing as many people and shaking as many hands as the stopover allowed. On the lush island of Bali, the Kennedys wore the traditional flower leis and were showered by flower petals. It was one of their romantic stops, a bit of relaxation from visits where world problems were more keenly felt. And it was a stop Robert and Ethel Kennedy could take in style as well as in stride. On his arrival in West Berlin, Kennedy was met by Mayor Willy Brandt, and together they reviewed a guard of honor. He called the Berlin Wall shocking and shameful. Before he left the city, he recorded a message for broadcast to East Berlin, citing the difficulties under which the residents lived. In Rome, the Kennedys were granted a private audience with Pope John the 23rd. It was one of many visits members of the Kennedy family have made to the Vatican. President Kennedy, in his visit a year later, met with Pope John's successor, Pope Paul.
Those were the 1,000 days of the Kennedy administration, the spirit of what was called Camelot, of a young president who had pledged to get the country moving again. But it all ended that terrible November day in Dallas. CBS News correspondents pick up the story as the body of President Kennedy was returned to Washington.
This is the scene at Andrews Air Force Base where the casket of carrying the body of President Kennedy is being transferred to an ambulance. Behind it come Mrs. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy.
And now comes the family, the Attorney General, Mrs. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. Behind them, other members of the family. President Johnson.
In 1964, Kennedy won the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senator from New York.
I accept your nomination gratefully.
During the campaign, Kennedy's critics called him an interloper, running for office in New York, although he lived in Virginia and voted in Massachusetts. But Kennedy insisted that the basic question was, who was best suited to represent the state of New York? And he found many who were pleased that he had changed his locale.
President Kennedy said that we have the capacity to make this the best generation in the history of mankind or make it the last. I think we can make it the best generation in the history of mankind. I think all of us joined together can make that difference. Can't we just walk a few blocks and go down and register? Is that asking too much? You want to sing the song? All right, we sing a song. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Buenos tardes, amigos. Very good. They said that was very good. My accent is very good, everybody. I think that the effort that we're making against poverty, I think the war on poverty can have an effect here. Many of the parts of the war on poverty came out of the Department of Justice, and the efforts that we make to have people live decent lives, I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of expanding it. I don't say that being elected to the United States Senate is going to make these problems disappear, but I think that we can continue the same effort that was made in 1961. Viva Johnson! Viva Hubert Humphrey! Viva Frank Rossetti! Viva Robert Kennedy!
Robert Francis Kennedy was like a prism. The color he gave off depended on how you held him to the light. He gave everyone a choice. There was a Robert Kennedy to love and a Robert Kennedy to hate, a Robert Kennedy to trust, a Robert Kennedy to suspect. His idolaters were matched in the intensity of their affection for him only by the fury of those he angered. It is easier to say who is not a great man than who is, and we all bestow greatness quicker on our artists than on our politicians. History will find its own place for Robert Kennedy. He was in a time when physical comfort is so often the object of desire, a hard-driving, apparently fearless adventurer whose relentless energy took him to the tops of mountains, through dangerous rock-mined rapids, down snow-covered slopes, on excursions into the African bush. He seemed driven by an urge to risk his life on frequent occasions. He was, among overblown politicians, a cool political realist whose relentless aggressiveness was relieved by a sometimes irrepressible sense of humor, which he employed at his own expense.
I asked my wife as I was coming down whether she could think of a joke. She said, if they look at the top of your head, they'll laugh.
At a time when the young were confused and rebellious, he was a political apostle who offered some hope that there was worldly pleasure to be taken from noble actions.
Me a place that I can stand and I can move the world, said Archimedes. He might look back and say, but it's futile. What difference can one individual make? How can he change the world? What role can he play? But if we look back upon the history of this country and the history of the world, we know the difference that an individual can make.
His was the face that launched 1,000 successful magazine sales, and the publishing houses, almost daily it seemed, put forth books with that saleable face on the cover. There was never a let-up in the Bobby Kennedy phenomenon. It came and it went, but it ebbed more than it flowed. Just when it seemed to be subsiding, he made another speech critical of U.S. policy in Vietnam, wrote a sharply worded letter to another Democrat, made an impolitic remark at a press conference, or took a kayak trip up a creek, and the whole nation was caught up again with his very specialness. There was always the assumption of his great popularity, both by his friends and his enemies. They assumed he would someday reach the White House, yet no politician in modern times engendered such extremes of devotion and distrust. It was in all probability because of an unusual set of factors, some peculiar to American life, some peculiar to Kennedy's life. They pulled against each other, working to his advantage and his disadvantage. There was his public identification with his brother, John F. Kennedy, in the golden years of the new frontier. He was associated with the glamour of the early 60s when the White House had youth, style, and a French chef, and government looked like fun. He seemed capable of endowing his followers, many of whom embarrassed him by running ahead, with a zest for the notion that a single person can make this a better world.
We can't find answers to them completely, but at least we'll face them and at least we'll make progress with them.
His appeal was most obvious for the country's youth, particularly its college students. He told them they were important, that they must participate even though their elders in government, industry, and education did not trust them. He trusted them.
You have a much greater stake than any of the rest of us, because you've got the least ties to the past and really to the present, and the greatest stake in the future, much more than any of those that are presently within government. So what we do and the decisions that we make obviously have greatest effect on all of you. To make your voices heard and to work for policies and programs that you're interested in, not just to leave this school and turn your back on all of these matters, I think is essential. As I say, I don't have any easy way in which it's all going to be accomplished, but I would tell you that it can make a difference.
Robert Kennedy joked about lowering the voting age to 12. "I lose them after 25, he said. But Kennedy's identification with the young was also a personal one because he was young. He looked young, and he acted as if he always would be young. Many of those who worshiped John Kennedy came to worship Robert. Robert was a strange hero. Most American heroes have given up something important to attain their goal: money, pleasure, pride, or power. He seemed to have renounced none of these. Robert and Ethel Kennedy's family of 10 were based most of the year at the 10-acre Hickory Hill estate. It is what Ethel calls Bobby's backyard. He was a selfless father who took a lively and sympathetic interest in each child, whether it was the baby's first attempt at swimming or the eldest son's choice of a school. Kathleen, Joe, Bobby, David, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Christopher, Matthew, Douglas. And neither was he too busy to know their friends, Rumus, Panda, and Freckles, and Battlestar, the dogs, and the horses, and the iguanas, and the rabbits, and the turtles, and the geese. There will be another child he will never know. Kennedy's wealth, estimated at $10 million, his energy and his eternal youth, provided him with great mobility. It was hard to tell where he would turn up next. They had, for example, one gay time on the upper reaches of New York's Hudson River. With 7 of their 10 children and a station wagon full of nieces and nephews, including Carolyn Kennedy, the senator and his wife led an expedition of rubber rafts, canoes, and kayaks into midstream and had a ball. And when they skied at Sun Valley, the hills were covered with happy Kennedys. Bobby would take any hill. His form was described by a ski instructor as not very graceful, but damned aggressive. It must have seemed to many that Kennedy's life was a merry-go-round of glamorous people, births, balls, and a life where no moment was left unfilled. But these were the events that filled the cracks in his life. For the most part, his life was made of work, only less hard perhaps because he loved work as he loved play. It is some small consolation to know that he lived more life in 42 years than most would live in 80. The Kennedy critics saw much of this as money too obviously enjoyed, millions expended for fun, political power, and public image. But Robert Kennedy's life was not a series of theatrical happenings. He had staked out new ground on basic public policies, and in recent months he had spoken out often on the 3 most inflammatory issues in American life: Vietnam, civil rights, poverty. Each time he took what was, at the time he took it, a minority position.
The Negro has made great progress, which is true, and that he should be satisfied and be patient, which is neither true nor realistic. And if any man claims the Negro should be content or satisfied, let him say he would willingly change the color of his skin and go to live in the Negro section of any of our major cities. I happen to have some differences of some importance with the administration in connection with Vietnam. But I don't think that the answer or solution to Vietnam is to question the patriotism of those that we disagree with.
And I don't think that we've been putting enough of our resources into the fight against poverty over the period of the last few years. Now, undoubtedly the reason is because of the cost of the war in Vietnam. But we spent last year in the poverty war against poverty. On the OEO, we spent about the equivalent of about 2.5 weeks of the war in Vietnam, and I think we can do better than that.
The word ruthless was probably first applied to the senator 10 years ago when he was the combative chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee. His style seemed tough to tough old-line Democrats. It seemed too self-confident, too sophisticated. The word ruthless became affixed to him in the early 60s when, as Attorney General, he pursued the demons of segregation, racketeering, and price rigging in a manner many thought too zealous. In listening to people talk about Robert Kennedy, it was sometimes hard to believe they were talking about the same man.
He's much too abrasive. He's much too rude. He's terribly concerned about the people around him. He's terribly concerned about people in general.
He's been built up with this almost idolatry around him, and I guess he just feels that everybody should defer to what he wants and to accept his judgment on all problems.
I think it stems mostly from the fact that he's had the courage of his convictions and the courage to do what he thinks was right and to take it head on, and so people that don't like what he's done have said, well, he's ruthless.
I would describe Bob as dedicated and loyal. I would qualify that by saying that Bob believes so strongly in the ends he is pursuing that he is not over-scrupulous about the means that he employs.
Oh, he's a strong individual in the sense of character and determination. But I don't think he's ruthless, if that's what you mean. He's determined and persistent.
Ethel Kennedy was asked if it ever hurt.
Well, I suppose on some rare occasion, when somebody says something about him that's not very pleasant to hear.
He talked to CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd.
Aren't I being nice to you?
Oh, very nice. But
see?
But most people still have the view that
most.
Well, I suppose that's unfair. But
yes.
In the public prints, people are not surprised by it. They think there is always an ulterior motive in what you do. Is that?
Is that what?
Is that accurate?
No.
No.
What did you think I was going to say?
Is this something now that's gotten started and you can't do anything to stop it? The public image that you have?
I don't know.
Oh, how did it get started?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
The McCarthy thing and the Hoffa thing and the 60 campaign?
I suppose I've been in positions in which... But I don't know exactly. I don't know.
But Robert Kennedy had many constant reminders of his great popularity, his importance, and the significance of his life. He received an average of 50 speaking invitations a day, 6 days a week. It was not unusual for him to receive 2,500 letters in a single day. Robert Kennedy used every minute of his day. He walked from his office to the Capitol in all weather, not for exercise or recreation. It was 5 minutes away from 2,500 letters a day for a briefing by a knowledgeable aide. Hearings occupied much of Robert Kennedy's time, but they did not satisfy his full range of interest or curiosity about the subject.
Do you know anything about the poverty program?
No.
You ever heard of Head Start?
No.
Nice to see you.
Kennedy worked hard for his new state, New York, and he earned the grudging respects of many of his colleagues who had opposed him in 1964. In his first year in the Senate, he compiled a remarkable record for a senior senator, and he was only a freshman. No matter what he accomplished, it was too little to satisfy his soaring ambitions to do and to move and to make things go. He was asked whether the Senate was a satisfying place to be.
I think it's at times frustrating, the fact that you can't get more done, and you find there are matters that really require immediate attention, emergency matters, and that you feel strongly that the country or an area of the country would be better off, or a group of people, a part of our society would have better lives if we took a particular course of action, and to see it go on day after day, and that's frustrating. And if you're in the executive branch of the government, or a governor, I expect, or the executive branch of the government here in Washington, it's much more possible to take an action and see some results from it immediately. That's not possible in the United States Senate, so I think that part of it is frustrating.
What's your opinion of the quality of the United States Senate? Do you think generally the quality...
Very high. You know, there are some that perhaps that my respect for is less, but as a body and as a group of individuals, I think very, very highly of them. If you compare them to any other group of individuals, profession across the United States, I think they match or are superior to any other group in the country.
Just watching the Senate in action, it's occurred to me that senators have one characteristic in common, and that's vanity. Is that an accurate observation?
Well, somebody once said about the fact, you know, in the Senate presiding officer is called the president, and when somebody says, Mr. President, 100 pairs of eyes look up. I don't know. I suppose that everybody in politics, and you're up in front of crowds, and then to some extent you begin to think that what you say is important and significant, and because people clap at the beginning, when you stand up, people clap at the beginning, they clap at the end.
Do you think about running for president?
Well, I'm not being morbid about it. I just, making any plans to run, or making a decision that I will run, or knowing that at some future time in the history of the United States I'm going to run for president, I don't. I mean, quite frankly, I don't. Just because I don't think that you can plan the future at all.
On March 16th, Senator Kennedy had made up his mind to make the race for president.
I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who are now making them. I cannot stand aside from the contest that will decide our nation's future and our children's future. The remarkable New Hampshire campaign of Senator Eugene McCarthy has proven how deep are the present divisions within our party and within our country. Until that was publicly clear, my presence in the race would have been seen as a clash of personalities rather than issues. But now that that fight is won, and over policies which I have long been challenging, I must enter that race. The fight is just beginning, and I believe that I can win. I do not lightly dismiss the dangers and the difficulties of challenging an incumbent president. But these are not ordinary times, and this is not an ordinary election. At stake is not simply the leadership of our party and even our country. It is our right to the moral leadership of this planet.
It was just 4 days after Senator McCarthy's stunning performance in New Hampshire that Senator Kennedy set out to capture the Democratic nomination. He was criticized by those who said he should have gone into New Hampshire himself, and by those who said he should not have stolen the spotlight so abruptly from McCarthy. But Kennedy said the crucial issues of war and poverty dividing the country made it essential for him to run, and he said the people would understand his message. Although Kennedy was privately a rather shy and reserved man, he relished the almost bruising contact with the crowds that swelled and roared around him as they had for his brother. Occasionally, in all the public affection, he lost the tie clip, a handkerchief, even a shoe, anything his admirers could get their hands on. But he smiled through it all, and some said he needed physical proof of his popularity, tangible evidence that he was the candidate of the people. This was a campaign in which he seemed more relaxed and good-humored than ever before, a time in which he could laugh at himself and the persistent charges of his critics that he was too ambitious. He had to be, he said, as the seventh of 9 children, just to be able to survive. And he developed a bantering style with his audiences.
So will you give me your vote? And will you give me your hand? And are we going to win on Tuesday? And we'll win the Chicago Convention in August? And we'll win the election in November, and we'll make a difference for our citizens here in the United States of America. If I had a hair like that, I could get elected anyway.
Throughout the campaign, he emphasized his concern for the poor and forgotten in a rich country. He said the ghettos must be transformed into places where human beings could live decently, that the rich must be taxed more heavily to help pay for a better society, that the great divisions of class and color must be bridged over. He portrayed himself as the candidate of peace and reconciliation, and of a youthful, questing spirit, the spirit of a new style politics. His wife Ethel was frequently with him, contributing to the image of youth and high spirits. Those close to Kennedy said it particularly disturbed him that McCarthy had won the allegiance of so many of the young. But Kennedy, too, was the favorite of many young people to whom he directed his primary messages of peace in Vietnam and the rest of the world, and justice at home. This was a campaign of early triumphs for Kennedy in Indiana and Nebraska, and then defeat in the Oregon primary, the first time a Kennedy had lost an election. But then the tide turned for him in South Dakota and California. He talked confidently about Chicago and the convention.
Tuesday night began as the high point in Kennedy's campaign. He'd won the California primary, the one he had to win to stay in the race. But the exultant victory statement turned out to be his last speech before disaster. CBS News correspondent Terry Drinkwater reports.
What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or in the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country, and a selfish country, and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next few months. So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Kennedy left the platform quickly to escape the pushing, shoving, celebrating admirers. He went through a side door into a pantry next to the hotel kitchen, and there it happened. This next film begins perhaps 5 seconds after the shots were fired.
No, Rosie, no.
Look out for the gun. Okay. I'm doctor! I'm doctor!
Shoot it, please shoot it! Oh no!
Five others were also wounded. None is in critical condition now.
We need a doctor here desperately! Where's the doctor? Where's the doctor? Is there a doctor?
The The suspect, now identified as Sirhan Sirhan, was grabbed by Rafer Johnson and Rosie Greer, the two Kennedy men. Then he was led by police back through the ballroom and the hotel. Some of the officers had to protect him from the crowd. There were several Kennedy supporters, bystanders, who were close to hysteria at this point, and there was concern for the suspect's safety. In his pocket, officers found newspaper clippings attacking Kennedy. Sirhan is the man in the blue shirt, dark complexion at the far side of the squad car. Two of the others who were hit were brought back to the ballroom. By then, most people knew what had happened. 7 minutes before, this room was the place of Senator Kennedy's finest political triumph. At this moment, Kennedy was being taken on a stretcher from the hotel to an ambulance.
If there's a doctor in the house, I want to see him right here. Everybody else, please stay back.
The ambulance bearing Senator Kennedy arrived first at Central Receiving Hospital. Then, 3 of the other wounded were brought in. Doctors inside discovered for the first time the critical nature of Kennedy's wounds. They quickly decided to transfer him to Good Samaritan Hospital, where the facilities were better for delicate brain surgery.
Hold it, guys, hold it.
Mrs. Kennedy was with him all of the time, riding in the ambulance, now from one hospital to the other.
Oh, help me, help me, help me,
So we can get out. Please stand back. Please stand back. Out front. Mrs. Ballinger. There's a cable there. Back up. Mr. Boomer, do you have a card?
President Johnson, who said there are no words equal to the horror of this tragedy, when he heard of the shooting of Senator Kennedy, immediately ordered Secret Service bodyguards around all the major candidates for the presidency and for their families. Later, he addressed the nation.
Once again, the consequences of lawlessness, hatred, and unreason in its midst. It would be wrong, it would be self-deceptive to ignore the connection between that lawlessness and hatred and this act of violence. It would be just as wrong and just as self-deceptive to conclude from this act that our country itself is sick, that it's lost its balance, that it's lost its sense of direction, even its common decency. 200 million Americans did not strike down Robert Kennedy last night, any more than they struck down President John F. Kennedy in 1963, or Dr. Martin Luther King in April of this year. But those awful events give us ample warning that in a climate of extremism, of disrespect for law, of contempt for the rights of others, violence may bring down the very best among us. And a nation that tolerates violence in any form cannot expect to be able to confine it to just minor outbursts. My fellow citizens, we cannot. We just must not tolerate the sway of violent men among us. We must not permit men that are filled with hatred and careless of innocent lives to dominate our streets and fill our homes with fear. We cannot sanction the appeal to violence, no matter what its cause, no matter what the grievance from which it springs. There is never, and I say never, any justification for the violence that tears at the fabric of our national life, that inspires such fear in peaceful citizens that they arm themselves with deadly weapons, that sets citizen against citizen, or group against group, A great nation can guarantee freedom for its people and the hope of progressive change only under the rule of law. So let us, for God's sake, resolve to live under the law. Let us put an end to violence and to the preaching of violence.
The President also named a special commission to study violence in the national fabric, in the streets, in our homes, and in our public life. Of course, all political campaigns have been suspended, and Senator Kennedy's two leading opponents for the Democratic presidential nomination were among the first to issue sober shock statements.
No words can really fully convey the feeling that I have toward the Kennedy family in this time of their particular tragedy, or the feeling that one must have for the nation in the face of this tragedy, this new tragedy. It's not enough, in my judgment, to say that this is the act of one deranged man. If that is the case, that the nation, I think, bears too great a burden of guilt, really of a kind of neglect which has allowed the disposition of violence to grow here in our own land, and part of reflection of violence which we have visited upon the rest of the world, or at least upon a part of the world.
Like millions of other Americans and people throughout the world, I'm very sad, with a heart full of grief and sorrow over this terrible incident, this act of violence. I've been in touch with Senator Kennedy's family. I've tried to offer whatever consolation and sympathy I could.
Across the country and the world, the reactions to the shooting ranged from sorrow to bitterness. Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut said it seemed to him that our society is going crazy. Dodd had fought for a bill that would ban interstate gun sales, but saw his proposals weakened when the Senate voted to ban mail-order sales only of handguns, not rifles and shotguns. Senator Ralph Yarber of Texas said the land is permeated with violence. Barry Goldwater, the 1964 presidential candidate, called it an ugly, mindless act. And evangelist Billy Graham said he wept for his country. Pope Paul told the pilgrims at St. Peter's Basilica of his deep sorrow over the attack on Kennedy, and he added he wished the general indignation would give way to the will to banish from ourselves violence and crime. Richard Cardinal Cushing, Archbishop of Boston, an old friend of the Kennedys, dedicated a day of prayer for the senator and said he prayed it will never happen again. But he added, we did that before, too, a reference to the assassination of President Kennedy. And in New York, Archbishop Terence Cook added his words of sorrow.
May the Lord and giver of life sustain Senator Kennedy, and may the God of all consolation comfort his loved ones. At the same time, even while our minds and hearts are raised to God for Senator Kennedy and his family, the dread question confronts us. How can our country survive the rising tide of violence we are experiencing?
The clergy and the statesmen from their pulpits and podia speak of the violence that racks our world. They speak of Robert Francis Kennedy, but they speak too of every man. The people weep for the Kennedys. Perhaps they should weep too for themselves. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.